Hey everyone! Today we're diving into one of history's most brutal and disturbing episodes that most textbooks conveniently skip over. We're talking about what happened when a Persian queen decided that mercy was for the weak, and revenge was a dish best served with maximum suffering. If you think you know how dark ancient power struggles could get, trust me, you haven't heard this one yet. Hit that like button if you're ready for a story that's going to make you question everything you thought you knew about ancient royalty. And drop a comment telling me how far you think someone can go when power and vengeance collide. Let's get into it. So picture this. It's the late 6th century before the Common Era, and the Persian Empire is at its peak. We're talking about the largest empire the world has ever seen up to that point, stretching from modern-day Turkey all the way to the borders of India. At the heart of this massive power structure sits one woman who's about to become infamous for reasons that go way beyond typical palace intrigue. Her name is Atossa, though some sources refer to similar accounts involving other royal women of the Achaemenid dynasty. What matters is that this woman held real power in a world where women were supposed to be invisible. Now here's where things get interesting. According to several ancient historians, including fragments that have survived from Greek sources and Persian chronicles, there was an incident involving religious officials, what we might call temple priests or guardians of sacred spaces. These weren't just random religious figures. They were men who held significant influence, men who controlled access to the divine, men who thought they were untouchable because of their holy status. They were wrong. The exact details vary depending on which historical account you follow, but the core narrative remains consistent across multiple sources. These temple officials had apparently crossed a line. Some texts suggest they were involved in a conspiracy against the royal family. Others hint at something more personal. A violation of trust, or perhaps an insult that couldn't be overlooked in a culture where honor meant everything. What we do know with reasonable certainty is that this Persian queen decided that whatever these men had done deserved a punishment that would echo through the centuries. You have to understand the context here. In ancient Persia, temple officials weren't just spiritual leaders. They were political power brokers. They controlled vast wealth through donations and offerings. They had the ears of the common people, and most importantly, they could legitimize or delegitimize rulers through their interpretations of divine will. Taking action against them wasn't just about punishing individuals. It was about sending a message to every power center in the empire. No one is beyond the reach of the throne. According to the accounts that have come down to us, the queen didn't just order these men executed. That would have been too quick, too merciful, too forgettable. No. What she allegedly orchestrated was something far more calculated, far more theatrical, and far more horrifying. She wanted these men to suffer in a way that would strip away every shred of dignity, every pretense of their holy status, every claim to being closer to the gods than ordinary mortals. Now, before we get into the specific details of what happened, we need to talk about the nature of punishment in the ancient world. This isn't a pretty topic, but it's essential for understanding why what this queen did was considered exceptional even by the brutal standards of her time. In ancient Persia, as in most ancient civilizations, execution methods were designed to serve multiple purposes beyond simply ending someone's life. They were meant to deter others, to demonstrate the power of the state, and sometimes to ritually purify society by removing corrupting elements. The Persians had a reputation for creative brutality when it came to dealing with traitors and enemies. There was scaphism, where victims were trapped between two boats and fed milk and honey until insects and their own waste consumed them over days or weeks. There was impalement, which needs no explanation. There was being thrown to wild animals, burned alive, or simply buried up to the neck and left to die slowly under the sun. These weren't secrets. Everyone knew about them. They were part of the social contract. Obey the law and honor the throne, or face unimaginable consequences. But here's what made this particular incident different, according to the sources we have. The queen didn't choose any of the standard methods. She wanted something that would specifically target what these temple men valued most: their bodies, their masculinity, their perceived purity. Remember, these were men who presented themselves as intermediaries between humanity and the divine. They maintained strict codes of cleanliness and bodily integrity. Their physical wholeness was tied directly to their spiritual authority. So what did she do? According to several accounts, Though historians debate the exact details, and some consider parts of this story to be embellished or symbolic rather than literal. The queen ordered a form of punishment that involved systematic mutilation. Not all at once, mind you. That would defeat the purpose. This was designed to be drawn out, to maximize both physical agony and psychological destruction. The men were reportedly subjected to a process that would strip away their claims to divine favor, piece by piece, literally. Some sources suggest this involved castration, but not the relatively quick surgical procedure you might imagine. We're talking about a deliberate, prolonged process designed to cause maximum suffering while keeping the victims alive and conscious. Other accounts mention the removal of other body parts, fingers, toes, ears, nose, in a specific sequence that had symbolic meaning. Each mutilation corresponded to an aspect of their priestly duties they could no longer perform. Can't hold the sacred vessels without fingers. Can't smell the holy incense without a nose. Can't hear the prayers of the faithful without ears. Think about that for a second. This wasn't just about killing enemies. This was about deconstructing them as human beings while they were still alive to experience every moment of it. It was about transforming men who claimed divine connection into living examples of what happens when you forget that earthly power trumps heavenly authority every single time. Now, you're probably wondering, how do we actually know this happened? That's a fair question, and it's one that historians have been debating for centuries. The primary sources we have come from Greek historians who were writing about Persian affairs, often decades or even centuries after the events supposedly occurred. Herodotus mentions similar incidents, though not always with specific names attached. Ctesias, a Greek physician who spent time at the Persian court, recorded various accounts of royal cruelty and revenge, some of which align with this narrative. Here's the thing about ancient historical sources: they're messy, they're biased, they're often written by outsiders who had their own agendas. The Greeks in particular loved to portray the Persians as exotic, despotic, and excessively cruel because it made their own society look more civilized by comparison. So when we read these accounts, we have to ask ourselves, what's fact, what's exaggeration, and what's outright propaganda? That said, there's enough consistency across different sources to suggest that something significant happened involving a Persian royal woman and religious officials who met a terrible fate. Archaeological evidence from the period shows that the Persian Empire did practice public punishments as a form of social control. Royal inscriptions reference the punishment of rebels and traitors, though they typically don't go into graphic detail. And we know from multiple sources that women in the Achaemenid dynasty wielded considerable power, especially royal mothers and wives who could influence succession and policy. What we can say with reasonable confidence is this: whether the specific details are accurate or not, the story reflects a real dynamic in ancient Persian society. Royal power was absolute. Challenging it, especially through religious authority that might rival the throne's legitimacy, was incredibly dangerous, and punishments were designed not just to kill, but to make examples that would be remembered and feared for generations. Let me break the fourth wall for a second here. I know some of you in the comments are going to say this sounds like ancient propaganda or exaggeration, and you know what? You might be right. But here's the thing: even if the specific details are embellished, the underlying truth remains. This was a world where power was maintained through fear, where mercy was seen as weakness, and where crossing the wrong person could result in suffering beyond our modern comprehension. Whether this exact scenario happened precisely as described or represents a composite of multiple incidents, it tells us something important about how power operated in the ancient world. So, let's get into the mechanics of what allegedly happened after the initial punishments were carried out. Because here's where the story gets even darker, if you can believe that. According to some accounts, the queen didn't just want these men to suffer and die. She wanted them to live. She wanted them to survive their mutilations and be kept alive as permanent reminders of what defiance costs. Think about the logistics of that for a moment. In an era before modern medicine, before antibiotics, before even a basic understanding of infection control, keeping someone alive after severe mutilation would have required careful attention. The wounds would need to be cauterized to prevent fatal bleeding. The victims would need to be force-fed to prevent starvation. They'd need to be kept in conditions that minimized, though certainly didn't eliminate, the risk of deadly infection. This wasn't casual cruelty. This was systematic, organized, prolonged torture that required resources and planning. Some versions of the story claim that these mutilated priests were then displayed in public spaces, not executed and disposed of, but kept alive where people could see them, where other religious officials could see them, where anyone who might consider challenging royal authority could be reminded of the consequences. They became living monuments to the queen's power and ruthlessness. Their suffering wasn't just personal, it was political theater on the grandest scale. Now, there's another element to this story that several sources mention, though it's particularly difficult to verify. According to these accounts, the queen specifically chose this form of punishment because it aligned with certain Persian religious concepts about purity and pollution. In Zoroastrianism, which was the dominant religious system of ancient Persia, bodily integrity and cleanliness were deeply important. Certain forms of mutilation were thought to make a person ritually impure, unable to participate in religious ceremonies or even to be buried in the traditional manner after death. So if this detail is accurate, what the queen did was even more calculated than simple revenge. She wasn't just destroying these men physically. She was condemning them spiritually according to their own belief system. She was ensuring that even in death they would be outcasts, unable to receive proper burial rites, unable to be accepted by the gods they claimed to serve. It's psychological warfare at a level that's honestly terrifying to contemplate. Can you imagine being one of these men? You wake up every day in agony, your body destroyed piece by piece, knowing that not only are you suffering in this life, but according to everything you believe, you're damned in the next life too. Every hour that you're kept alive is another hour of physical torture compounded by spiritual despair. That's the level of punishment we're talking about here. Here's where we need to pause and consider the broader implications of this story, assuming it's at least partially based in historical reality. What does it tell us about power dynamics in ancient Persia, specifically about royal women and their ability to exercise authority? Because make no mistake, if a queen could order this kind of punishment and have it carried out without being stopped, that tells us something significant about the structure of Persian royal power. In many ancient societies, women, even royal women, were expected to operate behind the scenes. They could influence decisions through their husbands or sons, but direct public exercise of power was rare and often dangerous. But the Achaemenid Persian Empire was different in some important ways. Royal women, especially those of the main bloodline, held titles that came with real authority. They controlled their own estates, commanded their own servants and soldiers, and in some cases administered entire provinces. Atossa, who was the most likely candidate for the queen in this story based on timeline and power level, was particularly influential. She was the daughter of Cyrus the Great, sister-wife of Cambyses II, wife of Darius I, and mother of Xerxes I. That's essentially a dynasty concentrated in one person. According to Herodotus, she held more power than any other woman in the empire, and regularly influenced major policy decisions. If anyone could order the kind of punishment we're discussing, and have it executed without question, it would be her. But here's the thing that makes this story even more interesting from a historical perspective. Some scholars argue that accounts like this one were specifically created or exaggerated by Greek sources to portray Persian royal women as cruel and despotic, playing into Greek anxieties about powerful women and Oriental despotism. The Greeks had complicated feelings about female power. They respected it in limited contexts, like powerful goddesses or the occasional queen. But they also feared it, and often portrayed it as unnatural or dangerous. So we have to ask ourselves, is this story about a cruel queen who overstepped moral bounds? Or is it about Greek male anxiety projected onto Persian women who wielded power in ways that threatened Greek cultural norms? Or is it, most likely, some combination of both? A real incident that happened but was embellished and shaped in the retelling to serve the purposes of the storytellers? What we can say is that regardless of the specific truth of this incident, it reflects real tensions in ancient Persian society. Religious officials did hold significant power. They could and did come into conflict with royal authority. And when those conflicts occurred, the outcome was rarely peaceful. Someone had to establish dominance, and in an empire built on conquest and maintained through the projection of overwhelming force, half measures weren't really an option. Let's talk about the aftermath of this alleged incident, because the consequences rippled far beyond the immediate victims. According to some historical interpretations, this event, or events like it, fundamentally changed the relationship between religious authority and political power in the Persian Empire. Temple officials learned a harsh lesson. Spiritual authority meant nothing if it came into direct conflict with royal power. You could maintain your temples, conduct your rituals, and even offer advice to the throne, but you never, ever forgot who was really in charge. This dynamic played out repeatedly throughout Persian history. We see it in how later kings dealt with religious establishments in conquered territories. The Persians were generally tolerant of local religions, much more so than many ancient empires. But that tolerance came with a clear understanding. You worship your gods, you maintain your practices, but you acknowledge Persian supremacy. The moment religious authority started to look like it might challenge political control, things got ugly fast. Some historians argue that this approach, this clear subordination of religious to political power, was actually one of the reasons the Persian Empire was so stable for as long as it was. There were no religious civil wars of the kind that tore apart other ancient states. There were no priests declaring holy wars against heretical kings. The hierarchy was crystal clear, literally written in blood, if the stories we're discussing have any basis, in fact. But here's the flip side of that coin. When you rule through fear, when your authority rests on the memory of terrible punishments inflicted on those who defied you, what happens when that fear starts to fade? What happens when new generations come along who didn't witness the original atrocities? What happens when external enemies start to sense that maybe, just maybe, the empire isn't as invincible as it claims to be? This is the fundamental problem with terror as a governing strategy. It works brilliantly in the short term. Everyone falls in line. No one dares to object. Rebellion becomes unthinkable because the cost is too high. But terror has diminishing returns over time. The shock wears off. New grievances accumulate. And eventually, someone somewhere decides that they'd rather risk the terrible punishment than continue living under the system that threatens it. We see this pattern play out in the later history of the Persian Empire, as the decades and then centuries passed, as new rulers came to the throne who were further removed from the iron-fisted founders of the dynasty. Challenges to royal authority became more common. Provincial governors rebelled. Conquered peoples rose up. And yes, even religious officials occasionally found their courage again and backed opposition movements against kings they deemed impious or illegitimate. Now let's consider something that most people don't think about when they hear stories like this. What about the people who actually carried out these punishments? Because if this incident happened even remotely as described, there had to be executioners, torturers, people who performed the actual mutilations and then tended to the victims to keep them alive. What kind of person takes that job? What does it do to you psychologically to inflict that level of suffering day after day? In ancient Persia, as in most ancient societies, executioners and torturers were often drawn from specific groups. Sometimes they were slaves who had no choice. Sometimes they were members of lower castes or ethnic groups who were barred from other professions. Sometimes they were soldiers who saw it as just another duty in service to the throne. But regardless of who they were, they existed in a strange social limbo. They were necessary for maintaining order, but they were also tainted by their association with death and suffering. Some sources suggest that in the Persian court, there were specialists who were trained specifically in prolonging suffering, in keeping victims alive through procedures that should have killed them. These weren't sadists acting on impulse. They were technicians applying their craft. They knew exactly how to cauterize a wound to prevent fatal bleeding. They knew which mutilations could be performed without triggering fatal shock. They knew how to manage pain to keep a victim conscious but not so agonized that they died from the trauma. Think about the level of anatomical knowledge that would require. This is centuries before the development of modern medicine. But these practitioners had to understand human physiology well enough to deconstruct it systematically. In a weird way, this kind of knowledge probably contributed to medical understanding more broadly. The techniques used to torture and keep people alive through torture could be adapted to treat injuries and illness. It's a dark thought, but medical progress and human cruelty have walked hand in hand throughout history. But back to the human element. Imagine being ordered to mutilate religious officials, men who many people in society revered as holy. Even if you're just following orders, even if you believe the queen has legitimate reasons for this punishment, that has to weigh on you. You're violating every social and religious norm about respecting the sacred. You're doing things that will probably ensure you're outcasts from normal society for the rest of your life. And you have to live with the sounds of suffering, the visual of what you've done, the knowledge that you've caused irreversible harm to other human beings. Some scholars argue that this is why torture and execution in many ancient societies took on ritual aspects. It wasn't just about the practical goal of punishment. It was about creating a framework that allowed the executioners to psychologically process what they were doing. By making it ceremonial, by giving it structure and meaning beyond simple violence, societies tried to protect the mental health of the people they forced to do their dirty work. It didn't always work, judging by ancient accounts of executioners who went mad or committed suicide. But it was an attempt to manage the psychological cost of organized cruelty. We need to talk about the question that's probably been nagging at you this whole time. Did these men deserve what happened to them? According to the accounts we have, they were punished for some kind of offense against the royal family or the state. But what offense could possibly justify this level of suffering? And who gets to make that determination? Here's where we run into one of the fundamental problems with absolute monarchy as a system of government. When one person, or in this case one woman, has the power to decide matters of life and death without any checks or balances, the line between justice and revenge becomes awfully blurry. Maybe these temple officials really did commit treason. Maybe they were plotting to overthrow the legitimate government. Or maybe they just said something the queen didn't like. Maybe they challenged her authority in a way that she found intolerable. Maybe the whole thing was personal rather than political. We don't actually know what the original offense was, and that's significant in itself. The fact that different sources give different reasons, or no reasons at all, suggests that either the justification was considered self-evident at the time or it wasn't actually that important. What mattered was the demonstration of power, not the legitimacy of the grievance that triggered it. This pattern shows up repeatedly in ancient history. A ruler feels disrespected or threatened. They lash out with overwhelming force. And then historians have to reconstruct what actually happened based on fragmentary sources that were often written by people with their own agendas. The truth gets buried under layers of propaganda, legend, and the simple passage of time. What we're left with are stories that reveal more about the nature of power than about specific historical facts. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that these temple officials really were plotting against the throne. Let's say they were planning to assassinate the queen or her family, or they were embezzling vast sums from the royal treasury, or they were planning to use their religious authority to spark a civil war. Does that justify what allegedly happened to them? That's not a question with an easy answer, and it's one that every society has to grapple with in some form. Modern legal systems try to separate justice from vengeance. We have concepts like proportionality, due process, prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment. These exist specifically because we've learned through bitter historical experience that when we let power act without restraint, the results are horrifying. But these are modern concepts. They would have been largely meaningless in ancient Persia. Justice wasn't about rehabilitation or proportionality. It was about maintaining order through fear, and order meant the stability of the existing power structure. Let's zoom out for a moment and consider what this story, assuming it has some basis in reality, tells us about the evolution of human civilization and our relationship with violence and power. Because, as brutal as this account is, it's not unique. Every ancient civilization has similar stories. The Romans had their crucifixions and gladiatorial games. The Assyrians had mass impalements and deportations. The Aztecs had ritual human sacrifice on an industrial scale. Pick any society before the modern era, and you'll find accounts of spectacular cruelty in service of maintaining power. So what changed? Why don't modern governments, at least most of them, engage in this kind of public torture and mutilation? It's not because humans are fundamentally less cruel than we used to be. Our capacity for violence hasn't diminished. What's changed is our systems of power and the way those systems legitimate themselves. Ancient rulers derived their authority from various sources: divine right, military conquest, hereditary succession, or some combination of these. But in all cases, their power rested ultimately on the ability to use force and the willingness to use it without restraint. Public punishment wasn't just about deterring crime. It was about demonstrating that the ruler possessed overwhelming power and was willing to use it in ways that ordinary people couldn't even imagine. It was about creating a psychological distance between the ruled and the ruler, a sense that the person on the throne operated on a completely different moral plane from normal humans. Modern democratic states, for all their flaws, derive legitimacy from different sources: the consent of the governed, constitutional law, democratic processes. They still use violence, make no mistake about that. But that violence is supposed to be constrained by law and subject to public accountability. When modern states use torture or excessive force, they typically try to hide it because it undermines their legitimacy rather than reinforcing it. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The difference between ancient Persia and modern democracies isn't as vast as we'd like to think. The capacity for state-sanctioned cruelty still exists. The structures that could enable it are still in place. What prevents it, when it is prevented, isn't human goodness or moral progress. It's institutional constraints, public accountability, and the fact that citizens in democracies have ways to push back against government overreach that subjects in ancient empires simply didn't have. This is why stories like the one we've been discussing matter. They're not just ancient history. They're reminders of what humans are capable of when power is unchecked. They're warnings about what happens when we let fear and revenge drive our justice systems. And they're case studies in why we need to maintain the institutional safeguards that prevent any individual or small group from wielding absolute power over others. So where does that leave us with the specific question posed by this video's title? What did a Persian queen do to the men of the temple that was worse than we imagine? Based on the historical sources we have, fragmentary and debated as they are, the answer seems to be that she ordered a form of punishment designed to maximize suffering while keeping the victims alive as long as possible. Systematic mutilation carried out in stages, designed to strip away physical capability, social status, religious purity, and human dignity, all while ensuring the victims remained conscious and aware of what was being done to them. Whether this happened exactly as described or represents an amalgamation of multiple incidents or includes elements of propaganda and exaggeration, we may never know with complete certainty. What we can say is that it fits within the broader pattern of how power operated in the ancient world. Challenges to authority were met with responses designed to be so terrible, so memorable, that no one would dare try it again. The lasting impact of incidents like this, assuming they occurred, extended far beyond the immediate victims. They created a climate of fear that shaped behavior for generations. They established precedents that other rulers would reference when dealing with their own challengers. And they contributed to a culture where absolute obedience to political authority was the only rational choice, because the alternative was literally unthinkable. But here's what might be the darkest aspect of this whole story. It probably worked. The temple officials, if they existed as described, never challenged royal authority again. Other potential rebels thought twice before acting. The social order was maintained. From the perspective of the ruler, this was a successful application of power. The suffering of a few individuals prevented larger conflicts that might have killed thousands. That's the logic of terror as governance. And it's frighteningly effective in the short term. Yet there's a cost to this approach that doesn't show up in the immediate historical record. When you rule through fear, you create a society where trust is impossible, where loyalty is always suspect, where every relationship is potentially a threat. You create a world where no one can afford to show weakness or mercy, because those are vulnerabilities that enemies will exploit. And eventually, that kind of society collapses under the weight of its own paranoia and brutality. The Persian Empire did eventually fall, not to internal rebellion but to external conquest by Alexander the Great. But you have to wonder whether the internal dynamics created by centuries of rule through fear and spectacular punishment contributed to that fall. When your system depends on absolute authority maintained through terror, what happens when someone comes along who isn't afraid? When the fear that held everything together dissipates, the whole structure can collapse with shocking speed. Before we wrap up, I want to address something that I'm sure is on many of your minds. Why does this story matter today? Why should we care about what a Persian queen may or may not have done to some temple officials 2,500 years ago? It's a fair question, and it deserves a thoughtful answer. First, understanding how power operated in the ancient world helps us recognize the patterns when they show up in our own time. The specifics change, the technologies evolve, but the fundamental dynamics of power, fear, and control remain remarkably consistent across centuries and cultures. When we see modern examples of political violence, systematic torture, or the use of exemplary punishment to terrorize populations, we're seeing echoes of the same strategies that ancient rulers employed. Second, stories like this challenge us to think about the moral dimensions of power and justice. In an era where we're constantly debating criminal justice reform, the appropriate use of state violence, and the limits of punishment, looking at historical examples of what happens when those limits don't exist provides crucial context. We can see the endpoint of a logic that says the state has unlimited authority to punish its enemies, and it's not pretty. Third, and this might be the most important point, these stories remind us that the victims of political violence were real people. It's easy to talk about ancient history in abstract terms, to discuss power dynamics and political strategies as if they were chess moves. But behind every account of torture and execution were human beings who suffered and died, often for reasons that had nothing to do with justice, and everything to do with the ambitions and fears of those in power. When we read about systematic mutilation and prolonged torture, even in an ancient context, we should feel uncomfortable. That discomfort is appropriate. It's a recognition of shared humanity across time. The men in this story, if they existed, felt pain the same way we do. They experienced fear and despair the same way we would. They were destroyed by power wielded without mercy or restraint. And if we can't extend empathy across centuries to those victims, what hope do we have of exercising empathy for the victims of injustice in our own time? There's also a lesson here about the nature of historical truth and how stories get transmitted across time. We've talked throughout this video about uncertainty, about different sources giving different accounts, about the possibility of exaggeration or propaganda. That's not a bug in the historical record. It's a feature. It teaches us to be skeptical, to ask questions, to recognize that what we think we know about the past is always provisional and subject to revision based on new evidence or new interpretations. This is relevant beyond ancient history. In our current era of information overload and competing narratives, the ability to evaluate sources, to distinguish between well-supported claims and speculation, to hold multiple possibilities in mind simultaneously while we wait for better evidence, these are crucial skills. Ancient history gives us a relatively low-stakes arena to practice those skills before we apply them to more immediately contentious topics. So let's bring this home. What a Persian queen did to the men of the temple, according to the accounts we have, was design a punishment so cruel and prolonged that it shocked even a society accustomed to brutal violence. She ordered systematic mutilation intended not just to kill, but to destroy every aspect of these men's identity, physical, social, and spiritual. She kept them alive to serve as walking warnings of what happens when religious authority challenges political power. And in doing so, she created a legacy that has echoed through the centuries, becoming part of the way we understand how power operates at its most ruthless. Whether every detail of this story is historically accurate, or whether some elements are exaggerated or symbolic, the core truth remains. This was a world where power was absolute and often absolutely brutal. It was a world where mercy was rare and usually strategic rather than heartfelt. It was a world where the gap between rulers and ruled was so vast that they barely seemed to belong to the same species, let alone the same moral universe. And here's the thing that should keep us up at night. That world isn't as distant from our own as we'd like to believe. The same impulses that drove ancient rulers to spectacular cruelty still exist. The same human capacity for causing suffering when we're convinced it serves a higher purpose still exists. What's different now is that we've built systems, imperfect and frequently violated as they are, designed to constrain those impulses. We've created legal frameworks that say no, you can't just torture people because you have the power to do so. We've established principles of human rights that apply even to our worst enemies. But those systems only work as long as we defend them. The moment we decide that our enemies don't deserve legal protection, that our security justifies any means, that the threat we face is so great that normal rules don't apply, we're sliding back toward the logic that animated the Persian queen in our story. We're accepting the premise that power gives the right to inflict unlimited suffering on those deemed deserving of it. The men of the temple in this account, assuming they existed, are long dead. Their suffering ended more than 2 millennia ago. But the questions their story raises are still with us. Who gets to decide what punishment is just? What limits, if any, should exist on the state's power to cause suffering? How do we balance security and order against mercy and human rights? These aren't ancient questions. They're urgent contemporary ones. If you've made it this far, thank you for sticking with a story that's been as difficult to tell as it probably was to hear. Drop a comment and let me know what you think. Are we really that different from our ancient ancestors? Have we genuinely progressed morally? Or have we just gotten better at hiding our capacity for cruelty? And what does it say about us that stories like this one still fascinate us thousands of years later? Hit that like button if you want more deep dives into the dark corners of history, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, remember, power without accountability, ancient or modern, is always dangerous. Always.